This is the central topic for tonight, both the research going into it and the fact that this book decided I had to write it. Let's go back a bit to the last major depression. The year was 1935. Roosevelt was president. The Dust Bowl was in the middle of happening. The major storms were in 33 and it was over by 35. The rain started in 35. And the funding for these WPA arts projects came through in 1935. There were 4 of them. A tiny part of the WPA, the Overall Works Progress Administration, which was trying to put out of work America back to work, get the economy functioning just by paying people to do something that might or might not be useful, so they could spend it on food and get the economy going. There was the Federal Arts Project, which was about painting, Writers Project, music and theater projects, respectively. Funding came through in 35. They all started working in 1936. In Mississippi, of particular interest for tonight, the Federal Music Project cranked up. Now, Mississippi has always been a poor state, and the largest city at the time was Jackson. The people running the Federal Music Project in Washington were classical music prodigies, and they strongly believed that any funding they had, any efforts they were going to apply to spending this money would go to benefit classical music and nothing else. So there was an extreme bias against folk music. So what could they do in Mississippi? They managed to get, I think, 9 performers paid for. 9 in the entire state, because there was no audience and no venues. All 9 of those performers were in Jackson. They did manage to get about 130 people teaching. I assume they were classical violin and piano teachers. Documentation that's not real good. And things were going along quite well. They were teaching, they made a major impact. They taught for free so that they wouldn't compete and take money away from people that were paid. They always teamed up with community organizations like the Kiwanis. And everything's going great. They're enrolled, they got lots of students. And then early in 1936, there was an outbreak of polio. The state health department shut down the schools and shut down this teaching program because they were trying to cut down the vectors of the disease. And Jerome Sage, the lady that was running the Federal Music Project, suddenly had a major political problem. She's got people on the payroll and nothing to do. This is the era that the anti-New Deal opposition was virulently opposed to the arts programs. Why should they pay somebody to paint? They had a hard enough time understanding they should pay somebody to dig ditches and make roads. This is the time when the term boondoggle was invented. So Jerome Sage knew she had to come up with something quick. She put her heads together with some of the smart people she was working with, and they decided to research folk music. Did I mention these were classical musicians? They had no clue. But they were smart people. They researched in the universities for dissertations, for books about folk music, and they tried to find out what work had been done in the state and build on it. They were lucky. There was a guy named A.P. Hudson who had just finished writing a book of folk songs of Mississippi and their sources. It came out in 1937. It wasn't in print yet, but they got a copy of the manuscript. It's a wonderful book. In that, it was the first, and until our book came out, the only book on Mississippi folk music, at least white folk music. It was magnificent in that it got the complete lyrics for, I think, 140 some odd ballads. This is the child ballad era, where they're all about the words and the text of the song, and how it's changed over time. And isn't it wonderful that these English yeomen wound up in Mississippi? It seems a little misguided to me. So it's wonderful for that, if you're into that, and it was also wonderful in that they told you who the sources were and where they lived, and this was really critically important. The downside was that A.P. Hudson could neither read nor write music notation and had no way of getting the melodies in the book, so you got the words with no tunes. Really helpful from a musician's point of view. But the Federal Writers Project came across this manuscript, and now they have a roadmap. They don't really know that much about folk music, but they know which songs to get the music to and where the people live. So they started sending people out. And all summer in '36, they sent them out collecting folk music. And because they really didn't know what they were doing, and they had put kind of skimpy guidelines, they brought back everything. It's somewhere north of 3,500 songs and fiddle tunes in notation in the Mississippi State Archive, where I stumbled across them. 180 of those are fiddle tunes. Now, the great thing is, unlike academics and folklorists that have an agenda and a point of view and they go collect a certain thing, these people had no clue, so they brought back everything. Religious songs, songs that somebody had learned off of 78, parlor tunes from the 1800s, a little bit of blues, just a little bit of everything. So you get an interesting snapshot of what vernacular music was in Mississippi in 1936, kind of a baseline thing. That almost never happens in folklore. What happened when they got all this stuff collected? Well, by the winter, the polio epidemic was over. There was no interest in the Federal Music Project upper echelon to continue the project. So this pile of paper, boxes and boxes of tiny little scraps of paper, because paper was expensive. They couldn't even get lined books of sheet music to write on. They had to rule out their own lines, and the paper in these boxes is really stunning. It screams poverty of resources and great richness of musical resources. So the boxes sat on the desks in the WP offices in Jackson. Some of the paper got shipped back to Washington so they could prove they had actually done something for the money they'd dispersed. And nothing happens. They had hoped to get a book out, but they had no ability to do so. Zip forward to 1939, January, I believe. Pete Seeger's father, Charles Seeger, is now the assistant director of the Federal Music Project, working for Sokolov, the director. He's in Washington. He was an avant-garde classical musical theorist, as was his second wife, Ruth Seeger. But they've become quite enamored and self-educated in folk music. He comes across these manuscripts, notations of Mississippi music, and realizes that they're really distinct, unlike elsewhere, and just vibrantly rich. So, backtrack a bit about politics. The funding came through in 1935 for all these WPA arts projects, and at every funding opportunity subsequent to that, until the funding was entirely cut in 1939, the anti-New opposition whacked away at the budget. Sounds like contemporary politics, doesn't it? So Charles Seeger in early 1939, and B.A. Botkin and Alan Lomax and this cadre of folk music enthusiasts in Washington could see which way the wind was blowing. So they pulled together as kind of a last gasp of the federal arts projects in Washington. They pool resources from all over the WPA. They get a World War I ambulance, kind of a panel van thing, for free, donated. They use WPA mechanics to rip it apart, get it roadworthy, put it in their cot, shelves for 300 pounds of then state-of-the-art recording equipment, a Presto disc cutter, food, everything someone would need to travel through the tropics of Mississippi in the summer on dirt roads. They hire a rotund and rather pale New Yorker, Herbert Halbert, because he was expert in using the Presto disc cutter. He'd done field work in New Jersey. He worked for the Federal Theater Project at the time. And then they had the stroke of genius. Now, I know many of you are players and you've encountered things like a song called Cocaine Habit, that the label on the disc says Croquet Habit because some Yankee wrote it down. You can guess what sort of chaos might have ensued with Herbert Halbert's solo driving through Mississippi, being directed to record singers and fiddle players. They're going, I don't blame it. So they teamed him up with a Federal Writers Project worker named Abbott Ferris, who was local. Spoke the dialect, knew how to talk to people right, knew how to do it nice and slow. And he did the interviewing. Genealogies, floor plans of their house, did a drawing of how one plays a violin with straws for rhythm. Wrote down complete lyrics where, due to the scarcity of recording discs, they would record a verse and a chorus, but he would write out accurately all the other verses. So we got a really big bang for the buck by adding the two of them together, and all of the 600 some odd typewritten pages of documentation that they created in that month in Mississippi of this music. You don't have to go dumpster diving in those dusty archives and boxes. I made sure all of that got in the book. I wanted to make sure every last bit of that information is public. Abbott Ferris also shot 4 rolls of film, beautiful portraits of the sources, and there's copies of the book back there. When we take a break, I strongly encourage you to take a look at some of the photographs. They're just wonderful. Those of you that have seen the publicity for the Yam Taters Festival in Mississippi have seen Dave Morgan's renderings from those photographs. So they created, he came back with over 400 recordings, 147 of which are banjo and fiddle tunes. We painstakingly transcribed them and put them in the book. There's, I think, 4 more tunes from some later field recordings that were relevant and important, and they're in there as well. So what became of these recordings after they were made in 1939? As I said, shortly after Howard returned to Washington, the budget was cut completely. The recordings went to the Library of Congress, went in a box and stayed there pretty much. The paper materials, the manuscripts, devolved back to the States and stayed there pretty much till I got there a few years ago. Unseen, unheard. So the news flash is, I'm going to play a few of the tunes during this set, and then we're going to play some more of them together. And the friendlier ones are the ones we're going to play together, and the crankier ones will be the ones that I play. So the materials have basically been hidden. Now, a few of the tunes, like Grub Springs from Claunch, have been issued on some Library of Congress recordings. A handful of the recordings have seeped out over the years. There was an LP in 1987 called Great Big Yam Taters, which the festival in Natchez was named after. But I made sure that every last one of those 147 recordings got issued from Document Records. They're available. Bookmarks are on the counter. Please take one. It'll tell you where you can hear every tune in the book, or if those of you that would not be interested in the book but would like to hear these great field recordings, it'll tell you how you can get them. Last plug, and I'll move into playing some tunes. I recorded a good number of what I think are the most interesting tunes from the first half of the book, which is based on the manuscripts. Not everybody reads fluently, and the manuscripts are, after all, something of a cartoon of what might have originally been played. So I tried to make them walk and talk and breathe, and argue with me if you don't like my interpretation. That would be fun. I also have an earlier recording of Mississippi tunes based on 78s from my home county of Carroll County. My mom was born there. I was born just over the county line in a hospital in the next county. So I come by this somewhat honestly, though I left the state when I was 1. I've been going back my whole life, and I've been doing a lot of research there in recent years, and we'll be there next month. So this is part 1 of the obsession that I've been living with for years, and you're going to be subjected to for the next few minutes. I'm not yet done. I'm working on a second volume to make sure every known Mississippi fiddle tune is in print somewhere, somehow, and available, because I think they're wonderful. Now, let me play you some. And this is fairly informal. See how informal it is? If you have questions, shout them out. We'll happy to share the obsession. Oh, so the fellow on the cover of the book is John Alexander Brown of Iuka, Mississippi. Iuka is in the extreme northeastern corner of the state, almost out of the state. He's a farmer and a charismatic figure. He did a version of Wolves A-Howling. On the recording, you can hear singing and fiddle playing. He did the fiddle playing, and John Hatcher did the singing. And I'm working off that recording, but I have some additional verses that are from a ballad singer that Halpert recorded, Miss Burma Grissom. So it's a bit of a composite.